Good evening. Welcome to PoliticIt podcast. Tonight we have Barry Short with us, and Barry is the candidate for lieutenant governor from the Libertarian Party. Let's talk a little bit about you.
Sure. What would you like to know?
You went to Whittier to school,
right? I should say right up front, I am not a native Utahn.
Yeah.
I was born in Southern California.
So where in Southern California?
The city of San Dimas, which is way out on the eastern edge of Los Angeles County.
Oh.
So when I was a kid, that was still an agricultural area, citrus primarily, that was being grown out there. So I grew up in what was a small town in Southern California. It no longer is. And that's part of the reason that I left about 20 years ago. I moved to Cedar City.
You're in Cedar, huh?
I'm in Cedar City.
Okay.
Which at the time I moved there was a whole lot more like the place I grew up in than the place I grew up in was. You know, it had just grown. When I graduated from high school, there were about 14,000 people in San Dimas. There are now something around 80,000 in the same town. And it looks like every other town in Southern California with the exact same stores, the exact same fast food, the exact same everything. And frankly, it's not very interesting anymore. Which is too bad. I really like the area. San Dimas is on old Route 66.
That's...
So it was a neat
So you
place.
got your kicks then on...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it was great.
So what took you to Whittier?
I actually spent the first couple of years of my high school, I decided I wanted to get out of Southern California just to see something different. I've always had a little bit of wanderlust, to be honest. And I was at Concordia College up in Minnesota for 2 years, but 2 years was enough to convince me it was just way too cold up in Minnesota. And so I came back home, but rather than going to a JC or one of the state colleges, I went to a private college, Whittier, which was nice. It had some really innovative educational programs going on at that time that I really appreciated.
So what took you to the Libertarian bent? Because Whittier's not exactly the bedrock place for libertarian thought, but I'm a big fan of the Austrian economist and the work of Bastiat and others, and what drove you there?
Well, I actually think it goes clear back to when I was in high school. The very first presidential election that I was eligible to vote in was the election of 1976. And that was Jimmy Carter versus Gerald Ford. And frankly, I didn't care much for either one of them. Ford was a leftover of the Nixon administration, and I found Nixon to have been a failure in far too many ways, particularly in terms of his inability to get us unentangled from Vietnam, which he promised when he was elected in 1968. And Jimmy Carter at that point was kind of an unknown peanut farmer from Georgia. We all have a lot of respect for him now and the things he did as an ex-president.
Right. Well, it's interesting that we actually have probably the worst president we ever had become probably the best ex-president we ever had.
In a lot of ways, that's right. Although, if you go back and look at his record, and I won't do that all right now, but he's actually pretty good for deregulation. Far more than even Ronald Reagan was, believe it or not. He deregulated a whole lot of things. But he's also, on the other hand, responsible for the Department of Education, which is probably the worst thing to come out of D.C.
Well,
price fixing. Although, again, when you talk about wage and price controls, those were the origin of the Libertarian Party when Richard Nixon declared wage and price controls in order to deal with inflation. And a bunch of people over in Colorado Springs, David Nolan, who lived there, Carl Bray, who was a longtime resident here in Salt Lake City and was the founder of the Libertarian movement in Utah, was there at the time, and they all put their heads together and said, we need a new political party that's going to focus on individual liberty and understand something about economics, that you cannot force this sort of thing.
Right.
It always backfires. But going back to me and how I found it, part of it was very much frustration over Nixon. I had a very low draft number. I was an honors student, and my government looked at me as a hunk of meat. And that was pretty repellent to me, I have to say. So I began looking for other alternatives. And in 1976, that was the second year that the Libertarian Party had a candidate for president, was a gentleman named Roger MacBride. And Roger MacBride came to the Libertarian Party's attention because in 1972, he was elected as an elector, a Republican elector, to the Electoral College.
Interesting.
And he said, I can't vote for Richard Nixon. And he cast his vote for John Hospers, who was the Libertarian candidate in 1972, our very first candidate, and Tony Nathan, who was our candidate for vice president, the first woman in U.S. history to receive an electoral vote, is a Libertarian. People don't realize that. That's kind of a neat thing. Also the first Jewish person to receive an electoral vote. So from the very beginning, we started setting some interesting firsts. But I found him. I thought, I don't know a whole lot about him at this point, but I know he has to be better than these two people that the Republicans and Democrats are trying to stick me with. And so I voted for him. But 2 years later, there was a gentleman named Ed Clark who was running for governor of California, which is where I lived. And I heard a long interview with him on the radio, and it was like, okay, I'm sold. We have a government that's too invasive, too intrusive, that's taking too much of my money and spending it on things that I don't even support spending any money on. And I said, okay, this is where I belong, and that was my home. Now, like a lot of people, and a lot of people here in Utah, I maintained voter registration as a Republican for a number of years because I thought maybe we could push the party in the direction I wanted to see it go. Over time, I came to the conclusion that that wasn't a winning strategy. And as a result, I just left that behind, and I focused all of my efforts now on working within the Libertarian Party and in getting out and talking to people and explaining to them what our positions are, what we want to accomplish, what we're hoping to do. And I'm very pleased to say that things are going in the right direction here in Utah. Of the states that have partisan voter registration, Utah now has the second highest Libertarian registration in the entire country.
Wow.
The only state that's ahead of us, you'd never guess. It's Nebraska.
Oh, interesting.
Nebraska has something in common with Utah in that they, as we, have had a sitting state senator switch party alliance to the Libertarian Party. There it was Laura Ebke, who was from Creighton, Nebraska. And of course here it was Senator Madsen, who, before his term ended, switched his allegiance to the Libertarian Party. So we have had a seated Libertarian senator here in Utah.
Oh, interesting.
Mark Madsen's a great guy. He's right now, he's moved to New Hampshire, and he's working with the Libertarian Policy Institute back there after serving a mission term, I believe, in Peru. But he's come back and he's working and is helping us all around the country to help get Libertarians elected.
Very good. And so that's part of your responsibility then, because you are the state party chair.
That's right. I'm the state party chair, and I have a lot of responsibilities there, but it's to help basically just get the message out and let people know we're here, we're a viable alternative. I've got people who are accomplished, who are ready to step into roles and lead. Every poll that's done in the U.S. and here in Utah that asks the question, do you think we need a third political party? It's like 65% of people all tell us, yes, we need another political party. The two parties that we have are not delivering what we want. Well, my job, part of it is to say we already have one, we're here, we're ready to roll.
Yeah, very good. Hey, we're going to take a break and we'll come right back. Okay.
You bet.
Hey Siri, how do I get to the state capitol?
John, the fastest way to get to the Capitol is to make a lot of empty promises, to get help from special interest groups and endorsements from politicians. You will also need to buy a better suit.
That's not going to work for me, Siri. You need to find another way.
John, listen to me. If you're going to win your race, you will need to play the political game. You also need to use more hairspray and buy a golden retriever. Also, a new phone case would be nice.
That's enough of this.
John, are you there? Did you just leave me on the road? Fine. Keep your principles, John.
My name's John Johnson. I'm not running to be part of a system, and I don't owe anyone special favors. I'm running to listen to and work for you. I'm running to get results. We're back here with Barry Short from the Libertarian Party and the candidate for Lieutenant Governor. So let's talk a little bit about your motivation to run for Lieutenant Governor. What motivated you to that position, and why is that position important in your mind?
You know, I feel like the lieutenant governor's race doesn't get very much attention in this state, and it really ought to. Because back about 30 years ago, Utah decided that the lieutenant governor was costing the state a lot of money, but he didn't really have much of anything to do other than maybe check on the governor's health and see if he needed to fill in on something. And so the decision was made to abolish the position of Secretary of State and give those duties instead to the lieutenant governor. From a fiscal standpoint, that made a lot of sense. But as we look at it now, there was a piece missing that we really forgot, and that is that the lieutenant governor is not individually elected in this state. The lieutenant governor is elected on a ticket with the governor. And modern politics being what it is, the person who's chosen to be the lieutenant governor candidate in most tickets is not chosen because they have particular expertise applicable to running the elections office for the state of Utah. They're there to balance the ticket in some way. You know, maybe the governor candidate is from the urban part of the state, so he needs a lieutenant governor from the rural part of the state, or vice versa. Or, you know, maybe our current governor's decided that a female voice in his administration was a good idea. So there are all of these things that enter in, but we need somebody in the lieutenant governor's office who's actually going to be dedicated to running elections the way we expect elections to be run. We want them to be clean, we want them to be honest, and more than that, we want them to be meticulous. We want to make sure that we get everything right when we do elections.
Well, and I would add transparency to that too.
Transparency.
Right? Openness and you know, because the more people can look in, the better we are.
Well, that's exactly right. And we all know that we have a crisis of confidence with our elections in Utah right now. Our current lieutenant governor acknowledged that in the speech she made at the University of Utah about, a week and a half ago. And she talked about the fact that people aren't confident. Where I separate from her in her analysis of it is that she kind of lectured us and told us that we ought to stop doubting the system. Well, the way you stop doubting the system is that transparency. You know, when I was a kid in school and I took math classes, I didn't just have to get the right answer. I had to show my work. I mean, right? Didn't you have to do that?
Yeah.
You had to show the process that you did. And what we've done is that we've taken so much of the transparency in our process away from the public that it really shouldn't be any surprise that they have some mistrust towards what's going on. And we've had a number of crises over the past few years, and frankly, I think the office has handled them poorly. Let me give you a couple of examples. One, 2 years ago, there was a Republican primary down in Washington County between the two Republican candidates, and at the end of the count, that count was separated by 7 votes. Hugely tight, which by state law triggered an automatic recount. Everyone thought that was the right thing to do. But then they did the recount. And what they did wasn't what anybody thought a recount would be. They took what was approximately 3% of the ballots, ran them through the counting machine, got the total. They took that same stack of ballots, ran it through the counting machine a second time, and it got the same total, and they said, okay, we've audited the ballots. Well, nobody believed that was a legitimate audit when you're talking about 7 votes and you only did 3%. I mean, couldn't you at least take it to a different machine in another county and have a separate count done that way? Does the other guy's machine come up with the same number? And frankly, in a primary, in a House race, there aren't that many ballots. Simply counting them all by hand wouldn't have been that huge a task. That's not an onerous thing to ask of a county clerk. And frankly, there are plenty of people in the community that would have pitched in to make sure that was done efficiently, quickly, and accurately. But we cut everybody out, and we told them, just accept what we've told you. That's a bad strategy. And we need to step in and say, when we are doing a recount, it means recounting all of the ballots.
Right.
That's the same issue that we've had this year with the governor's collected signatures, and so many of them being withheld. We don't even know what those signatures are. And we've had the state auditor do a partial audit. We've had the legislature do a legislative audit. The two of them somewhat disagreed about what their results were. But certainly our state auditor gave the most tepid endorsement I could imagine. Well, I looked at a small percentage of them. I think it's statistically likely that he met the threshold. Well, that's not a very strong endorsement at all. And again, I'm just a guy here.
But I would probably say, hey, as an audit, that's different than a recount, right? An audit, you do a statistical sample, and then you say, is this within a small error rate of being legitimate? And if it is, that's where you stop. If it's not, then you're going to dig deeper. Yep. And actually, the legislative audit dug a lot deeper.
Right.
But it was still statistical sampling.
It's still statistical sampling, and I'm not saying statistical sampling is never valid, obviously, right. But I think when things are really close and really tight, it meets the definition
of an audit.
It meets the definition of an audit,
and that election wasn't that was a different issue,
right?
I do think this privacy law really confused things a lot.
I think it did. I personally was a little bit shocked by the number of names that were being withheld among the signatures that were collected. As a party chair, I've used our voter rolls to do direct mailings and things at a number of times, and I know how many of those come back as undeliverable.
Right.
And I know how many are being withheld. And statistically, it should be maybe 10% are withheld, not 30%. So, these sort of things make you look at it and scratch your head. And that doesn't say that they're never justified. It says that these are reasons to look at this situation and say, well, how did that happen? Let's come up, make sure there's a good explanation for why things are coming up the way they are. Another thing that happened 2 years ago, as I mentioned, I live in Iron County, and 2 years ago, our ballots never arrived in the mail. They were lost somewhere because, of course, Utah uses outside vendors to print and mail the ballots. We don't do that in-house. We don't have a government printing agency or anything. And what happened is that apparently most of a ballot, or rather several boxes of ballots, got stuck on a pallet somewhere in a warehouse, and they never left. So with about a week and a half to go, our county clerk had to fly into action, get printed ballots done, set up a polling place, and actually do voting in person, because otherwise we couldn't have voted at all.
Wow.
My understanding is that this also happened to a slightly lesser degree in Carbon County in that election, that a large portion of their voters just didn't get ballots.
Wow.
That sort of thing doesn't give people confidence in the system. So I like voting by mail, right, personally, but I also know there's a flaw there in that there are a lot of ballots, because of that, going to mailboxes where there isn't somebody there to receive them. Most of them go back to the clerks, but there's a certain amount that are in limbo. So I'd like to see us go to more of an opt-in for receiving your ballot by mail as opposed to it being a default.
Right. Those things make sense.
Yeah.
So we're about out of time.
Sure.
But I want you to address, since you're also state party chair, I want you. So, can you explain what the Libertarian Party is all about? Why are you different than the other parties? What are the fundamental intellectual foundations that you go off of?
This is going to sound really simplistic, but maybe it is, and maybe it's intentionally simplistic. There are two things that you're taught when you're a little child, which is don't hurt other people, don't take their stuff. Right?
Right.
That's the first thing you learn that we all teach children, right? We think that ought to be applied in the way government works as well. That government should be extremely limited. That unless I'm hurting someone, you ought to leave me alone. That's the fundamental position of the Libertarian Party.
Where does your liberty begin and where does mine end?
That's right, and that's tough. That's part of the reason we have a court system, so that occasionally there may be some litigation over whether I'm infringing on your liberty or not.
Right.
But we have a court system that can handle that, and we need a whole lot less preemptive attempting to handle it for things that aren't very important. The dime store simple version is fiscally conservative, socially liberal. Actually, what we are in both of those instances is non-interventionist. We think government ought to stay in its lane in both areas.
So limited government is a big deal.
Limited government is a very big deal because,
and that kind of goes back. That kind of goes back to Bastiat, right?
That goes
in the pamphlet he put out called The Law, right?
The Law, yes.
He basically outlines that idea that what is the proper role of government? Where does the government even have a role? Some libertarians will say, you ought to hire your own police force, right? Some of them, so
there are cities doing that.
Yeah, so you go to, maybe total anarchy, but you're somewhere in between those, right?
Right. We're not total anarchists. We believe there is a role. As I said, the court system is extremely important. We think that's essential.
So you're going to defend contracts. You're going to defend property rights.
Right. Although we think it's possible for two people entering into a contract to select an arbitrator who is not necessarily a government arbitrator. As long as they both are in agreement that this is the person that is going to make a ruling, that I don't necessarily need a government-run court in order to do that. So I think
as long as you have a way of enforcing it.
As long as there is a way, right, as long as there is some way of enforcing it. The bottom line is that government is terrible power. It always is. The fact is, government is force, it's violence. Now, that doesn't mean that we can live in a world with zero violence, zero force. That's not going to happen because there's a very tiny percentage of people who, for whatever reason, don't have a moral compass that keeps them from doing harm to others. But most people don't fall into that group.
Someone has to be that arbitrator if they're not, right?
Right. There has to be, there's a limit at some point.
So enforcement of contracts is an important thing.
Hugely important. Absolutely.
Individual liberty.
Individual liberty is absolutely fundamental. We talk about a lot in society now about group rights, but if you defend everyone's individual rights, you don't have to worry about group rights because everybody's rights have already been defended.
Right. Yeah. In fact, that whole concept of group rights is a little bit weird, right? Because you get a group together that decides they have super rights over another group.
That's exactly right. And
then individual liberty is...
And then individual liberty gets infringed because of some perception of a group. So we don't like that, but we do very much favor strongly enforcing everyone's individual rights and having, again, a government that is as minimally intrusive in people's lives as possible, as minimally as possible picks their pockets. Yeah.
Very good.
That's where we're at.
So let's go back. We're out of time, but I'm going to let you give a final pitch to voters. What would you say? Why don't you just look in that camera and give a pitch?
Okay.
Why should people vote for you?
Hello. My name is Barry Short. I'm the chair of the Utah Libertarian Party, and I am our candidate for lieutenant governor. You know, every time a poll is taken, 65% of Americans and 65% of Utahns say that we need another political party, not just the two old political parties that we have. Well, I'm here to tell you that the Libertarian Party is that option. I'm here to tell you that we have people who are prepared, who have all of the tools necessary, who have all of the knowledge necessary to step into leadership roles and give you the kind of government that you actually want and deserve. A government that's going to leave you alone whenever possible, that's going to protect your rights when absolutely necessary, that's not going to pick your pocket, that's not going to treat you like their unlimited ATM. And I want to tell you that if you've ever wanted to send a message to the world, to the state of Utah, to the United States, there's one thing you can do, and that is that on election night, you can make all of the media light up Utah in gold instead of red or blue. That will be the shot heard round the world when we light up and we turn things over to a new party, to new leadership, to the ideas that are rooted in the founding of America and the freedom of individuals and in your right to live your life as you choose, so long as you are not doing harm to anyone else. So if you're in favor of that, please vote Rob Latham for governor, Barry Short for lieutenant governor, and we'll deliver you the government that you want and you deserve. Thank you
very much. Nice having you here.
Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it.
And we'll see you guys next week.
All right.